Good evening. My name is Zachary Keene, and today I'll be discussing the disaster management structure of South Korea. South Korea is a peninsula nation that is located in the West Pacific Ocean bordering North Korea. To start, I have labeled a red pinpoint in the map to show where South Korea is located. A great way to start this presentation is by thinking of some of the geological and geographical issues that could come up for a country in this area of the world. One of the most meaningful pieces of information that I found regarding South Korea and its connection to the disaster management that it uses is its spirit. The people tend to have a spirit regarding overcoming and rising to the occasion. A famous proverb in South Korean culture reads, "Guseng kute najionda," which means at the end of hardship comes happiness. I find that this perfectly represents the ideals of disaster management planning for South Korean people, and I hope you'll see this as well by the end of my presentation. First, some background information about South Korea. It is a small to medium-sized country with a population of about 52 million people. The capital city is Seoul, and it follows a representative democratic republic government system. Its flag is internationally recognized and can be seen on the background of the slide. South Korea originally formatted their government in a manner to respond to disaster in times of need. To begin, we can glance briefly into the past during the Korean War. In 1953, at the end of the Korean War, South Korea officially became its own independent state known as the Republic of Korea. Although they suffered great losses, it didn't prevent the hazards that were also appearing due to the environmental stimulus around them. In response, the government decided to form several organizations that had little to no communication with each other, while all covering different potential disasters. The first of which was the Korea Meteorological Association, or KMA, which was tasked with the chronic floods that were hitting the country on a continual basis. The Meteorological Association, tasked as head of disaster management at the time, developed two major areas of advancement: automation of telecommunication systems and the acquisition of supercomputers for disaster management response. The Ministry of Public Safety and Security became the Ministry of the Interior and Safety as a result of continuous acts and law changes formatting government response systems. This was the cabinet that made the decisions of preparedness and response for the country. The last organization is the modern version, which we'll get to know a little bit more later, known as the National Emergency Management System, or NEMA, which was created as a response to the 2004 disasters. To better understand the organizational system, we're going to look at the organizational approach to disaster management before and after 2004. Before the changes of 2004, there simply wasn't an organizational structure behind the South Korean disaster management system. Rather, it was a collection of policies and acts that listed proper action plans. The first of these major acts was the Civil Defense Act of 1975, which aimed to protect both the citizens and the economy from possible enemy attacks or invasions. This was a serious problem because the war had just ended and they wanted to protect themselves. The next act was the Natural Disaster Countermeasure Act of 1995, which was associated with the KMA as previously mentioned. It dealt with almost all disaster management events and stemmed from both flood needs and typhoon relief needs for the people. The last act was the Emergency Management Act of 1995 that dealt with the response action of the government and the structure of internal affairs during and after disaster. These acts seem to be relevant and impactful, but they missed a major component of disaster management, and that's the actual preparedness and planning aspects. Planning is step one when it comes to proper management, emergency management, and disaster management because it allows for the public and government to have set procedures for action and relief. For these reasons, they needed change that came in 2004, and it came with the passage of the Emergency and Safety Management Basic Act. This act comprehensively combined all disaster management emergency planning efforts from the acts before it into one basic act. The act did allow for more organization in terms of response to disasters, which was its primary objective, but it also gave control over disaster management preparation to the Ministry of Public Safety, which is the present day Ministry of the Interior and Safety. It also denoted the Vice Minister of the Interior and Safety to serve as the head of disaster management for the country, directing response during a disaster and preparation guidelines that are going to be followed during it. When specifically reviewing the organizational structure of South Korea, there's both positives and negatives to this approach. Strengths resonate in the investment that the government gives to the development of disaster preparation, but it's limited by the specificity used in determining who has what responsibilities amidst a disaster. When looking at the makeup of the governance levels in South Korea, there are three noticeable sectors of power. The first is made up of the central government, which controls the comprehensive emergency management strategy. Its powers and responsibilities are laid out in the Basic Act of denoting them as the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, in times of crisis. The two levels of government are known as the metropolitan government and the local government. Metropolitan governments run regional cities and work directly with NEMA on crisis management and response. Local governments are similar as they are regional but are considered to be lower level and are expected to follow the guidance of the central government. This would be associated with a top-down approach, but these governments do have more of a say than meets the eye. The lower level governments set up their own sections of emergency management to handle primary continuous hazards. An example of this would be coastal cities having specific metropolitan and local management systems for dealing with flooding after typhoons. The central government guides the issue, aiding with the support, but the lower level governments are the ones that make the true action decisions relevant to the crisis. The next topic of discussion is the hazards that plague South Korea. The best way to analyze this is by setting up a hazard identification chart. One main hazard that is nationally recognized in South Korea is the major risk of typhoons. These storms bring with them flooding and landslides, which in turn causes more damage and death added on to the original disaster. In order to deal with this, South Korea not only has to plan for the typhoon, but also for hazards that come to fruition as a result of it. This can be difficult because it's much harder to plan for hazards that cause damage directly after a hazard, as they must take into consideration the strength and severity of the storms. Natural hazards are not the only type of hazard that plagues South Korea. There are very high rates of technological hazards in both the infrastructure and industrial sectors of hazard identification. Fires have seemed to be a continuous problem for South Korea, both industrially and naturally. They are very susceptible to forest fires because of the topography and climate of the country. For example, in just 2021, there were over 340 reported cases of wildfires. In response, the government created a system of firefighters and do-gooders known as public servicemen who serve their public and the country in times of emergency. Infrastructure is also a major problem, and the fires do not help with this as it causes more damage than normally would. Overall, a better system for assessing fires has been developed with a color code response chart. The last major hazard to discuss in South Korea deals with the political risks associated with intentional hazards. These hazards come to light due to the country's proximity and relationship with neighboring countries. North Korea, for example, has caused a constant need for hazard identification and preparation in the case of an emergency. South Korea has many military plans, and they also have evacuation procedures and safety bunkers in the case of ballistic attacks. The demilitarized zone is also evidence of a strong mitigation strategy that South Korea uses to prevent the possibility of attack or terrorism from the north. This is a depiction of the different types of hazards. There are high rates of volunteerism and international organizations that aid in recovery efforts in South Korea, but they are mostly independent mission organizations. These include the United Nations Action Response Committee, Red Cross, and a local relief organization known as Hope Bridge. These organizations assist in bringing people's lives back to normal amidst disaster events. All of these organizations provide strong aid and help the people before and after disaster, but there are obstacles to the effectiveness of their disaster management efforts. These obstacles arise as a direct result of misinformation, lack of connection to the people, and overestimations by the government. Misinformation is a real problem in modern-day mass media across the world. South Korea is no exception and has been dealing with the problem, especially after their pandemic. This occurs when information is stretched or manipulated to make the public perceive something in a different way. In response, South Korea has actively been creating laws to curb fake news within the country. By doing this, they hope to limit the amount of panic and blame that comes from modern media practices. Resulting legislation will put heavy fines on fake news as seen fit by the court systems. In South Korea, there has been a trend of disconnection between the people and their government elected officials. This is most likely a direct result of the pandemic, but it is cutting across to all areas of government planning. Trends are beginning to show that people trust their government less and aren't following government recommendations at the rate that they used to. This can cause a major obstacle in disaster management because the government relies on the public's participation to mitigate the damages. In response, local governments have been given greater responsibilities and tasked with renewing their connections with the people that they serve. The last major obstacle is the overestimations that the government makes in terms of their ability to respond to disasters. Governments need to be constantly adjusting, developing, and maturing their disaster management and emergency planning methods. It is dangerous to become too comfortable in this sector because you never know what is right around the corner. Take the pandemic as an example. For these reasons, governments need to be continuously identifying hazards, practicing emergency drills, and developing policy needs that fit the people's needs. These are my references. Thank you so much for watching.